Hey everyone, welcome back to Policy Punchline. Here at the show, we interview scholars, policymakers, and business executives about some of the most urgent issues and frontier ideas in our world today. I'm Princeton senior Tiger Gao. My guest today is Alex Tabarrok. He is the Bartley J. Madden Chair in economics at the Mercatus Center and a professor of economics at George Mason University. Along with Tyler Cowen, he is the co-author of the popular economics blog, Marginal Revolution, and co-founder of Marginal Revolution University. He is the author of numerous academic papers in the fields of law and economics, criminology, regulatory policy, voting theory, and other areas in political economy. He is also co-author with Tyler of the textbook Modern Principles of Economics, which is very widely used. He gave a TED Talk in 2009 and became very famous, and his articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many other publications. It is not an exaggeration to say that Professor Tabarrok, along with Tyler Cowen, wield an enormous influence over the intellectual discourse today in America, and especially amongst a lot of the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. I was talking to a lot of my friends and who work in startups in Silicon Valley, and I asked them who they follow on Twitter. They all say Alex Tabarrok. So this is hopefully we'll have a great conversation today. So Professor Tabarrok, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks. Good to be here. Thanks for the very kind introduction. I think there are some exaggerations there, but okay.
It is actually true. I mean, I don't know why, but you and Tyler Cowen have such a enormous influence over what Silicon Valley people are thinking these days. It seems that, I mean, especially when it comes to issues of techno-optimism or tech stagnation, which we should get into in a moment. But perhaps just to start us off with, maybe we can acquaint our listeners with who you are. Who is Alex Tabarrok? What kind of research does he do? Would you consider yourself a conservative, a free marketeer? Where do you stand on the spectrum?
So, when I'm always ID'd, right, as a libertarian economist, I think of myself more as an economist who is also a libertarian. Nobody ever IDs somebody as a middle of the road economist, but middle of the road is also an ideology. Anyway, so I've been at George Mason for many years. I do a lot of work in political economy, law and economics, public choice. So my work is often quite applied. And I think that's one reason why the blog, Marginal Revolution, has done so well, because we're always talking about how does economics apply to the world.
So you write about, I believe, just such a wide variety of topics: voting theory, better crowdfunding, healthcare prices, education prices, and you also sent me some other topics that we should talk about, like bounty hunters. And so it seems that COVID-19 was this crisis that, when it hit, a lot of your research and thinking was able to, you were able to put to use to them. So maybe it'd be nice to maybe start us off with what you saw as some of the moments early on in the pandemic that you were like, this is not going so well, and those are the places where economics can really play a big role in influencing policy decisions. Right.
So going back even quite a bit earlier, Tyler and I have been quite interested in pandemics and sort of fearful of pandemics for a long time. In fact, in our textbook, we talk about a pandemic as a supply shock, long before we actually had pandemics. And, we actually discuss pandemics, what are the right, policies for free trade, and it's all in the book. And when the avian flu pandemic happened, we thought that there was a pretty decent chance that was going to be a really big deal. And Tyler in particular was blogging on avian flu a lot. But this was something, we've always thought that this could happen in our lifetimes. So when it finally did, we were not surprised. It was going to happen sooner or later. I was tipped off early, I think, two things. One, on Twitter, people like Balaji Srinivasan, I think, was ahead of the curve. And I took that very seriously. He was like wearing masks before anybody else was. I took that very seriously. And then when I saw what China was doing, China was building a hospital in, 5 days. They shut down, Wuhan. And I couldn't understand why other people were not taking this so seriously, because if anything, the Chinese government is more concerned about the economy than they are about, people, right? So the fact that they were willing to shut down an entire city of 10 million people, that showed you how serious this was. And people in the United States were just brushing this off like, oh, this could never happen here. This is some weird thing going on in China. So when that started to happen in January, I knew this was a big deal.
Yeah, I still remember we had an Princeton professor, Jessica Metcalf, who is an epidemiologist, on the show last February 14th. It was Valentine's Day. I remember it very distinctly. We had her on the studio and she was saying this is going to become a global pandemic. And back then, New York Times were writing about China, but the US barely had a few cases. And I think that was kind of the shocker moment when she said that, and then everything ensued. So did you feel like the expert, at least at the top level, had an idea, or like the epidemiologists or public health officials that you interacted with were prescient, or did they also not really understand the significance and gravity of the issue?
Very, very, very few people understood. And, we'd gotten into complacency. I think in general, there's a lot of complacency in the United States, but I think we'd gotten complacent. We'd made it through the avian flu crisis and it kind of fizzled out. And we just thought that this was something which couldn't possibly affect us. And I think that was true right from the very top at the CDC. The CDC, their entire raison d'etre is to fight a pandemic. And yet they had become a bureaucratized institution. They were more like a university putting out papers than they were, a pandemic fighting institution, which is ready to go to battle. None of our institutions were ready to go to battle. That was really the thing which struck me. And even much later, even after the crisis, even after thousands of people were dying, I was talking with people in Congress quite regularly, and there was no energy there. I would talk to people in Congress. I say, you got to do this, you got to do the blah, 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 blah. And they said, well, we have to wait for the next bill, they have to, the next session, we got to do that. There was just no energy there whatsoever to fight this as a battle, which is the way I thought it should have been fought.
What were some of the initial policies that you think the US should have adopted, that you advocated for at the beginning of the pandemic when you look back, and how did your thinking gradually evolve as the situation evolved?
Right. So, of course, we now know that the thing about pandemics is it's an exponential process, right? And so you have to start fighting it when people think you're crazy. Because there's lots of examples, is like the chessboard, right? One grain of sand on the first square, and then 2 grains of sand on the second square, and 4 on the third, and very quickly you have more grains of sand, or I guess rice is the classic example, more rice than in the entire kingdom or in the entire world, right? Before you get to the 64th square, it's just a huge number. And so what this means is that if you're not early, then you lose control of the process. And the CDC, they botched the initial test. And not only did they botch it, but then the FDA, then in incredible irony, the FDA then said that private companies and labs cannot develop their own tests. So the oddity is that normally private labs and the states can develop tests, but because this was an emergency, you had to get permission, right? So we did exactly the wrong thing. Instead of saying this is an emergency, let's go on all different fronts and develop as many tests as quickly as possible, we instituted these bureaucratic procedures, and that just slowed things down. So that meant that we could not stop this. We did not get the first square or the second square or the third square. And by the time the tests were available, it was already spreading really rapidly in the United States. We just didn't know it.
I think you tweeted something like, in any, there could be many alternative universes where we could have succeeded in some way, but in every alternative universe, you have to start with testing. Basically, testing was very crucial. And anyways, but in a very recent op-ed on New York Times, Ezra Klein actually posed the question, "Is Alex Tabarrok right?" And he was saying that he and you have, very different, are on the opposite of the political or ideological spectrum, but you have emerged as an outspoken advocate for very drastic measures to fight the pandemic. And he wrote that Alex Tabarrok calls for vastly more spending to build vaccine manufacturing capacity, for giving half doses of Moderna's vaccine and delaying second doses of Pfizer's, for using the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine for the FDA to authorize rapid at-home tests, and for accelerating research through human challenge trials. So perhaps just to give our listeners an idea, what were your stances on vaccine, on spending, on government's investments at the beginning of the pandemic, and what is this idea of half dosing or first dosing, partial dosing?
Yeah, it's a funny story actually, because I'd written about using some prizes and using incentives to accelerate vaccine production, and then I was asked by the Domestic Policy Council at the White House and by the Council of Economic Advisors to get on a call with them. And I said, sure, I'm happy to do that. So I get on the call, and it turns out that it's me and Michael Kremer, his Nobel Prize winner, who won a Nobel Prize in part for his work on using incentives to accelerate a vaccine. So it's like, it's me and the world's expert on this question. Anyway, so in this call, I was really forthright, and I said, look, the economy is losing like $250 billion a month because of this pandemic and social distancing and so forth. So almost anything we do to accelerate vaccines is going to be worthwhile. So we ought to be spending a huge amount on accelerating vaccines. As I put it, this is the world's easiest cost benefit calculation, because billions are a lot less than trillions. And just accelerating a vaccine by a few months could easily be worth trillions. And I talked about human challenge trials. We need to get the human challenge trials, which is, instead of waiting, with the regular clinical trial, which is what we ended up doing. You have 40,000 people, 20,000 of them get the vaccine, 20,000 of them don't. And then you just wait for the ones who didn't get the vaccine. You just wait and wait and wait until enough of them die or enough of them get sick that you can then statistically compare, right? With a human challenge trial, you take not 20,000 people, but like 100 people, and 50 of them get the vaccine, 50 of them don't. And then you challenge the people. Actually, you don't even need the people not to get the vaccine. You just challenge people with the virus. So you give people the vaccine and you just challenge them with the virus and see how many of them get sick. And that's a much quicker way of finding out whether the vaccine actually is working. So I was talking about that. Anyway, Michael Kremer is a little bit more reserved than I am, but it turned out we were in complete agreement. We were in complete agreement, which was satisfying to me. Oh, thank goodness, the Nobel Prize winner,
Absolutely
is agreeing. And so after this talk, they asked us to write a report, and then Michael got on his his Rolodex and called his friends, Susan Athey and Chris Snyder and all these famous economists. And we wrote a report for the U.S. government, and we wrote one for the British government. And then we started producing, writing and researching this, developing a model. How much should we spend, right? How many vaccines should we support? And we developed a big model on this, gathering data. And it was, and anyway, that then as occupied my time for, the last year and a half. First doses first, that came because with the initial clinical trials of the Pfizer vaccine, the very first trial, you could see that the vaccine was working from the first dose. Even before people got the second dose, it looked like it was really efficacious. So that suggested to me immediately that if we focused on getting out first doses, we could vaccinate a lot more people much more quickly. The trials had the first dose coming, and then 3 weeks later, the second dose. But that 3 weeks later, they chose that time, not for any sort of scientific reason per se, but because that was the shortest amount of time, because they wanted to get the clinical trials done and the drug approved which was the right thing to do as quickly as possible. So you chose the shortest amount of time possible that you expected to see an effect. But given that the first dose was already effective, it turned out to be about 80% effective, it made a lot more sense to protect twice as many people at 80% than half as many people at sort of 95%. So I started pushing first doses first. The British then adopted that. Then later the Canadians did. And then more lately, the whole Kramer team, we have a paper which is coming out tomorrow actually on fractional dosing. It looks as well like, again, what they did in the clinical trials is we want to make sure that the thing we trial actually works, right? We don't want to waste a lot of time on running a whole bunch of different trials, some of which aren't going to work. Okay, so let's just go for a large dose, and we're pretty sure that the large dose will work. We'll get the drug approved, and then we can start giving it out. But in the phase 1 and phase 2 trials, the small trials, you can see that like a half dose or even a quarter dose appears to also generate a really robust immune system response. So a way of putting this is that if we could go to half doses or quarter doses, that's equivalent to doubling the number of, Moderna and Pfizer factories overnight. So this is $1 trillion bill, which is lying on the sidewalk, and we're trying to say, let's pick it up.
So in other words, even if you decrease the dose from 2 dose to 1 dose, or from 1 dose to half a dose or quarter a dose, the benefit that one would actually get is not being quartered. And if you could actually vaccinate as many people as possible with a reduced dosage, significantly more people, it would actually yield significantly exponentially higher benefits, especially when you are almost close to herd immunity. Then the economic cost becomes even greater and greater. But so in that sense, did you disagree with Europe or certain countries, even the US, decision to halt certain vaccines when, Johnson & Johnson or AstraZeneca? Certainly there was the hesitancy issue, that kind of helped the conspiracy theorist narratives. But also, did you feel like even if there were blood clots, statistically speaking, you should just move them forward? Or there are also scientists on the other side who say we should be cautious, and if there is a problem, we should.
Well, there's a bunch of different issues there. First of all, I think given the phase 1 and phase 2 trials, okay, it already, as early as August or so, even before, perhaps a little bit before, it would have made perfect sense for people at risk to have taken an unapproved vaccine. So I would have been in favor of allowing people to take a vaccine even before we had all of the data for the very big efficacy trials, which took a long time, of course, to happen, because you got to wait, right, until enough people get sick to make this comparison. But for somebody who was in a nursing home, who was elderly, or a person who was a physician, who was at high exposure, or a taxi driver, it would have made sense for them, would have been perfectly rational for them to take what was already a relatively safe, we already have decent information, not total information, but decent information on safety. And it would have made sense for them to have said, yeah, I'm willing to try this vaccine. So I think we should have done that much earlier. Then, of course, we had the emergency use authorization, and the FDA, took 3 weeks to even schedule a meeting, which the FDA was much faster than they usually are. You can take that as compliment or as criticism, as you like. But that 3 weeks was in December, when literally thousands of people were dying every single day. So in the 3 weeks that it took the FDA just to schedule the meeting, over 60,000 people died from COVID. So again, I think that was too slow. And then you got into, we should have done first doses first, right? Beginning in January, we should have followed the British. The British made the right decision. We should have done that in the United States. I think we could have saved lives. Canada later did it. Canada did first doses first after the British. And that enabled Canada to actually overtake the United States in the number of people who were at least partially vaccinated. So Canada started out more slowly because they didn't have enough vaccine. And then they finally figured out, listen, If we want to, vaccinate more people, we've got to go to first doses first, which is what they did. And that enabled them to catch up and in fact exceed the United States now.
Did you feel like the United States at least did a somewhat decent job, either with Operation Warp Speed, which injected a lot of funding to the vaccine operations? We had Robert Langer, who was the co-founder of Moderna, on the show, and he was saying, huge thanks to the government for putting so much effort into this. So one could say the US, relative to most other countries' bureaucracies, still did so much better, especially given the speed for vaccination.
Right.
How would you rate the United States government's performance?
Right. So Operation Warp Speed was the one thing we did right. That, of course, was what the Kramer team and myself were pushing. Right. In fact, we wanted to go bigger. So we were arguing for spending on a world scale of around 150 billion and 18 vaccine candidates. The US did by far the best. They spent about 15, 20 billion on Operation Warp Speed. The British spent a few billion, Europe a billion, but way less than we thought was justified, right? And ex post, we look correct. We were correct. I think everybody would be much happier now had we spent a lot more, another 10, 15 billion, or even 50 billion. If we'd had spent that a year and a half ago, we'd be in much better shape. We'd be even better shape today. So Operation Warp Speed was great. They totally did the right thing. They reduced regulation. They spent money. So I'm very happy about Operation Warp Speed. But that pretty much was the only good thing that the Trump administration did on the pandemic.
So perhaps we can talk a little bit more about the statistics and economics behind this, because I remember you talking on a different podcast, which was like the EU was trying to negotiate the vaccine price from like $8 or €8 per dose to $6. But the thing is, the expected value of actually vaccinating each person towards the height of the pandemic was like $1,000 per dose. So even if you invested dramatically more money, I mean, even you had, as you said, administered first dose much quicker earlier, when we did not know total information, even if we did that, that would have still given us a much higher, net positive expected utility. But why don't people think in that way? As an economist, you must have thought about this all the time. So I know Moderna said that, they had their mRNA vaccine like 2 days after the virus was sequenced. So why don't we start administering it then? Why do we need the whole FDA process, especially in a pandemic? Where should we not have had it?
Yeah. Well, like I said, I certainly, both as an economist and as a libertarian, I was in favor of allowing people to take the vaccine much earlier. That would have been provided a lot more information. You could have combined that with clinical trials, and I think it would have saved a lot of a lot of lives. People, it's very bizarre. People just approach, if you have never done this before, right? People just approach this with old mindsets. So, Europe, as you said quite correctly, was dickering over the price of the vaccine as if this were, like some expensive drug. And in fact, the vaccines they're incredibly cheap. I mean, they're ridiculously cheap. That's part of the problem, actually, is the vaccines are too cheap. Not that they're too expensive. I mean, the vaccines are anywhere between $4 and, $80 at the very top. Typically more like $4 to $40, for something which is you take once or maybe twice, it's going to save your life. This is like, as drugs go, as pharmaceuticals go, and as medical interventions go, this has a massively high benefit to cost ratio. So the time that Europe took dickering over the price, killed people, and it was not even remotely economically justified, but they came into this with this idea that the pharmaceutical companies are monopolists and they're going to rip us off, and, the usual kind of stuff. The Trump administration, again, I think not for any sort of rational reasons, but just for sort of emotional reasons, the idea of like throwing money at a problem wasn't so foreign to them. And the idea, let's just incentivize and, let's just go big. Trump is big on going big, bigly. Let's go bigly. And
we did, yeah.
And we did. So, but that was the only good thing that we did.
So speaking of the concept of expected value, at the beginning of COVID, a separate set of perhaps more publicly popular set of arguments surrounding this concept of expected value was about whether lockdowns were justified. Some economists, perhaps they're on the conservative side, perhaps not, they came out back then and they said, if you calculate the expected value of the lockdowns, it's like trillions of dollars, and that means roads don't get repaired, hospitals get shut down, and so on, such that more people will die eventually in the future. And if you just look at the virus, and people back then was disagreeing about how deadly the virus was, and they were saying it's not that deadly, so not that many people will die, and so on. Did you have a stance on that issue back then, especially as a libertarian, whether lockdowns were justified?
I mean, I have mixed feelings, and I didn't put a lot of, so I purposely made a kind of decision that if I was going to have any influence on the trajectory of events, then I wanted to kind of stay away from any social justice warrior kind of stuff. Like in general, I've been staying off Twitter, or been focusing my Twitter, on substantive stuff, and not trying to, take a position on the okay sign or something like that. And the same thing was true with lockdowns. I just figured I'm going to leave that one to somebody else. Okay. Now, because it was just too politically controversial. And if you make something on lockdowns, and people are less likely, if they don't agree with you on lockdowns, then they're less likely to follow your advice on vaccines. So I said, I'm just going to focus on vaccines. Given that we're now out of the pandemic, what is my view? I think the lockdowns, the interesting thing about lockdowns is there really was 2 times when they could have really high benefits. And unfortunately, both of these times are very difficult to do. One was at the very beginning, okay? Because if you can shut down the virus early and stop that exponential process, then you can have a huge impact. And that's what the South Koreans, did.
Australia.
Right,
yeah.
Exactly. The difficulty with doing that, of course, is that people think you're crazy because you're shutting down the entire country when there's like,
cases.
a few cases. Yeah, exactly. So it's politically very difficult to do. The second time lockdowns, I think, would have been useful was in the real run up in Christmas, Thanksgiving and Christmas. And that's when, 3,000 people a day were dying. And that was our second wave. And it was very, very deadly. But people by then were tired, and they wanted to go home. They wanted to have Thanksgiving. They wanted to have Christmas.
Yeah.
So again, it would have been politically very difficult to do it at that time, but that is the time when it could have saved a lot of lives.
So in other words, you would look at lockdowns also in a cost-benefit way, in terms of, I mean, in hindsight, but at the moment, it seemed that making the decision was very difficult. I mean, it just seemed that there was the political consensus that just ushered in globally that said we need to lock down, but there were people like the Great Barrington Project and so on that were just saying that this was not feasible. So I guess back then, if you were in the position back in March, well, how would you have reasons through these kind of cost-benefit analyses?
Yeah, I mean, I think in March I would have done it. But the lockdown can work if it's early and sharp and quick, and you knock the virus out, you stop the transmission, you get testing, right? So the idea of the lockdown is just to give you a little bit of a break so that you can get testing and identify the hotspots and things like that. And of course, we never followed up with testing, so we never got ahead of the virus. And because of that, then the lockdown just fades away in terms of importance. It just doesn't do, if you don't catch it early, then you can't really prevent this thing from spreading. It's very, very difficult. So these long lockdowns, I think, don't work very well. It's interesting, by the way, that people have entirely the wrong idea on the sort of the history of these things, because historically, up until very, very recently, the epidemiologists have been against lockdowns. The epidemiologists have been the ones who said lockdowns don't work, right? And it's really only in the past 10 years or so with Richard Hatchett and a few others, writing about this, that there's been some trend among the epidemiologists to think that it might work. But the Great Barrington people, they got, I was not in favor of Great Barrington, but they were reflecting the consensus actually of the epidemiological community, certainly up until very recently, and maybe even, up until, just slightly before the crisis, right? So they weren't crazy, they weren't crazy. That's what a lot of people thought. That was the consensus view, right? And that has only changed very recently.
Ezra Klein also wrote in his article that your current agenda is to finish vaccinating Americans and do everything in our power to accelerate vaccination around the rest of the world. And I think one statistic was saying that more than 75% of all vaccines have been administered in just 10 countries, like mostly the America, Western Europe, the more developed countries, and
It's
India.
a little bit
right
misleading now, because I think China has, administered
done very well.
billions, not billion, well, hundreds of millions, hundreds of millions
Yes.
of doses, even though as a proportion of their population, they're still not caught up to the United States. But as a proportion of the world, China has vaccinated a lot of people.
So what would be your next step plans? Would you mind telling us a little bit more about this?
Yeah. Sure. So, we wrote a paper in Science, the Kramer team, saying that it's not too late to do more. Okay. And, it's still a case of trillions versus billions. The faster you can do things, the better, right? A vaccine which is available today is worth a lot more than one which is available 6 months from now. But still, the cost benefit calculation is that the benefits far exceed the costs. So we should still be investing more in producing more vaccines. And I'm, of course, all in favor of, now that the United States has been vaccinated, in creating a plan to vaccinate the entire world. Fractional doses, I think, is going to be a key part of that. Because, as I said, if we could do a half dose, and maybe even you might say, well, let's do a full first dose and do a half dose for the second dose, right? A lot of people find, not everyone by any means, but a lot of people find that the second dose is a real doozy, right? Second dose looks too big. So even if you did like a half dose for the second dose, that still gives you like a 25% increase in the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, right? Which is a big deal. Like, how else could we, name anything else where tomorrow we can increase the supply by 25%? That's huge. Maybe we could do, half doses for people under the age of 50, let's say, right? So I think there is quite a bit of good information from the phase 1 and phase 2 trials that the correlates of immunity that you see in the immune system that you measure for half doses are very, very good. They look almost as good as for full doses. So I think there's a real opportunity here to vaccinate much more quickly if we look at fractional dosing.
I guess just to look back at the entire pandemic response, you initially said that CDC didn't do too good of a job. Dr. Fauci is repeatedly been put on the spotlight again, and recently there's a whole Fauci email thing going on that we don't have to go to the politics of it, but when you actually look at the responses where the scientific arguments made by someone like Fauci, or let's just say Fauci himself, did you feel like he did an adequate job? I mean, initially, people kept playing that 10-second footage of him going on 60 Minutes saying masks don't work, even though I think the arguments were a little bit more nuanced in it. But even if you look into the nuanced arguments, did you feel like he was wrong, or he is wrong, or?
I don't think he's been a great communicator, to be frank. I think in communication, you really, you need to tell the truth. And it's unclear whether, it's still unclear whether Fauci thought that the initial story which he told was actually that he knew masks worked, but he wanted to reserve them for, the doctors. And then later it turns out he really thought masks didn't work, so he was just wrong. I don't know what the truth is there, but I think you always ought to tell the truth, and you ought to give people, you ought to treat them less paternalistically, and give them, if you're uncertain, then give them some, range of uncertainty. People say, oh, it's too complicated. I don't care. Give them the truth. And if there is uncertainty, tell them the truth. And I don't think Fauci was really great on those issues. Now, look, he may have done many, many other wonderful things behind the scenes. Okay. Like just managing Trump. I could not have, I mean, he must have wanted to quit every single day. So, on those grounds, I'm sort of glad he was there, or somebody was there. But maybe his communication with the public was not the best.
Yeah. You mentioned that you're a libertarian. I guess the central question is, can you be a libertarian during COVID? Because even as a libertarian, you advocated for a lot of government intervention in this case, but a lot of people would say libertarianism does not prevent one from exercising government intervention in extraordinary times. Like we had Princeton professor Keith Whittington, who was a very famous libertarian, talk about this last summer. So can you be a libertarian during COVID? What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think there's a lot of reason to think that people have become more libertarian because of COVID. Because certainly, look, the government has failed on so many grounds. I mean, 600,000 people dead. That's a huge, huge failure. The government failed on testing. The FDA delayed, rapid antigen tests. The FDA delayed vaccines. So I think a lot of people have realized, you can't count on the government in an emergency. They're just not going to be there for you, and they may make many, many, many mistakes. So I think there's lots of reasons to become more libertarian. One of the interesting things to me, for many years I've been a critic of the FDA. I've said, the people who die because of FDA delay in approving new drugs and devices, they end up being buried in an invisible graveyard. Well, one thing about COVID is, for a lot of people, for the very first time, they're able to see the invisible graveyard. They're able to see the cost of FDA delay. Now, for people who have AIDS and cancer and other deadly diseases, this is not new. This is not new with COVID. So I think what I'm hoping is that one silver lining is that people will be more respectful, or more cognizant of the invisible graveyard. Now, having said all of that, yes, of course, it's also true that the pandemic illustrates government can be very useful, right? And Operation Warp Speed is an example of that. I think Operation Warp Speed is probably the highest benefit to cost ratio of government spending, maybe since like the Manhattan Project in, World War II. So I think that's been very, very useful to accelerate vaccines. And I'm pleased I had some, sort of maybe small role in that.
The invisible graveyard you mentioned, I guess in economics terms, that would be the unobserved counterfactual, because when you think about the treatment effect of a certain policy, you always want to say, had this not been implemented, what would have happened? And it's very hard to know what would have happened. And that's why you say, if a drug gets delayed for 3 months, the amount of people that you could have saved, I mean, it's a huge number, or so on. So we can get into that later, but I guess the takeaway from what you were saying about libertarianism, could we think of it as saying, when it comes to investments, when it comes to supporting innovations, the government should, in these moments, play a strong role, but when it comes to communications, for people to freely debate what to do, and that's sort of better handled through a more decentralized mechanism, and not just a paternalistic top-down approach, because government could be making mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, on the first point, I would say that ideally what you want is for government to channel self-interest towards the social good, right? So the invisible hand, that's exactly what the invisible hand does, right? The invisible hand is the ways in which the market channels self-interest towards the social good. That's what I mean by the invisible hand. Now, the invisible hand works under a lot of circumstances, but not all, not all. So when the invisible hand is not enough, then you want the visible hand. But the key is to make the visible hand work with the market, not against the market. And that's the sense in which Operation Warp Speed, I think, was a good idea, because it worked with the market. It lifted, got rid of regulations, it sped things up. It gave the more support, where the social returns were really high, much higher than the private returns. It added to those returns, right? So the problem is that the vaccine manufacturers were not making enough money, right? The problem is that the vaccine manufacturers only capture a small share of the total benefits of producing vaccines. So you want the government, the visible hand, to amplify the incentives there, not to work against the incentives, which is often what government is trying to do, but to amplify the incentives. And that's where I think the visible hand could be most useful.
So just a few questions ago, you were talking about you and Michael Kremer briefing the White House team, and you were saying that you guys overall agreed with each other, but there were some differences that you may have in the thinking. So maybe that this is a good way to highlight some of the unique ways you approach problems. What were the differences? Did you feel like your solutions often involved more conservative free market principles, or something that is more technologically involved? What were the differences?
No, well, so with Michael Kremer, the differences were just on style and not on substance. I mean, he has let's face it, he has a more of a reputation to protect. I'm more willing to go out on the ledge. So if anything, I would say my role on, the accelerating, we called it the Accelerating Health Technologies team. And really, I mean, it's been an incredible privilege of my life to work with a number of these top economists like Susan Athey and Michael Kremer and a bunch of these young guys, Brandon Tan and Witold Vicek is a statistician we worked with, and Camilo Castillo, young economist, brilliant people, right? These are people on the top of their game. And my role, if there was a specialization, was to be the tip of the sphere in terms of the public, and like, how do we message things and what direction should we be going, right? So I was kind of pushing on all of these grounds, and sort of was willing to take a public position and push. It was good for me to have the models in the background, right? To know that I was standing on some relatively secure foundations. And because of that, I felt more confident in pushing first doses first, and pushing fractional dosing, in pushing going quickly, and getting approval sooner, and things of that nature.
So you mentioned something like vaccine lottery. I don't know if this was something that you had in mind early on, but I guess when people hear these terms, like using a lottery system to incentivize people, they associate that with a type of thinking that Silicon Valley entrepreneurs or a certain type of thinkers often think about, that you don't hear from government bureaucracies, from traditional mainstream academic economists even. So would you say that there is a distinct difference between some of the more new ways of thinking and old ways of thinking?
Yeah, so I mean, you'd mentioned that sort of Tyler and I have sort of had some influence among Silicon Valley types. And I think one thing with respect to this crisis is that people in Silicon Valley, they're used to acting fast, right? They understand something going viral, right? So my colleague, Tyler Cowen, he raised like $65 million for a fast grants program. He and Patrick Collison, who is the CEO of Stripe, together they raised $65 million and continuing from people like Elon Musk and others, and to support fast grants. Now here, fast grants were grants given out to scientists to support funding on COVID. Now here's the amazing thing. Fast grants raised the money and dispersed the money before the NIH gave out a single grant. Okay, I mean, that's incredible, right? And there were top scientists, like Nobel Prize winning scientists, who could not get money from the NIH, but got money from, Tyler Cowen and Patrick Collison from the fast grants, right? And some of that money, without that early quick funding, that research might never have been done. That research might never have been done, right? So, I mean, that kind of, to me, is astounding at, given the state of the emergency that we were in, the NIH was still requiring, multi-page, peer-reviewed, proposals and documents, and going through all the usual procedures. They just proved themselves incapable of responding in a crisis.
Perhaps this is a great segue to talk about your connection with the Silicon Valley. There was this profile did on you that titled "Can Philosopher Alex Tabarrok Bridge the Wonks and Burning Man?" It was saying how these days libertarianism itself isn't as fringe as it once was. Indeed, even though Rand Paul's poll numbers are sinking, the moment he heralded in modern American politics hasn't had its a death knell run. The ideas championed by the anti-governmentalists are increasingly standard everywhere, from medical marijuana to gay marriage debates to Silicon Valley's radical deregulationist philosophy. Tabarrok's role is to bridge the road of the wonks and the Burning Man swords alike, and so on. It really, I do get the tangible feeling that a lot of people in Silicon Valley follow you and look up to you as a voice that could bridge the policy thinking in DC area, but also the Californian way of thinking. I guess, how did you and Tyler Cowen became so influential in this process? Maybe through Marginal Revolution, maybe through your other activities, but why did you feel like your economic ideas and theories appeal so much to the Silicon Valley types?
So Marginal Revolution has been, posting something every single day since like 2003. So it helps just to keep going. That may be part of it.
Perhaps we should also, I forgot to ask you about the genesis of Marginal Revolution. Maybe we can even start there. Yeah.
The genesis was, I told Tyler we should write a textbook, and he said, "You're right, but first we should start a blog." And this was at the very beginning of the blog era. And of course, Tyler was correct, because writing on the blog, you've got to get to the point quickly, right? You have to give your, we call the Marginal Revolution dim sum for the mind, right? Little bites. And so that helped when we later came to write our textbook. How we came to be influential in Silicon Valley, I guess there's a whole bunch of different reasons, perhaps. One is that Silicon Valley certainly combines this idea of socially liberal, right? And, people used to say are fiscally conservative or whatever, right? So that kind of libertarian, sort of in between. And certainly, Tyler and I have long been in favor of, gay marriage and, medical marijuana deregulation and things like that. At the same time, where we also want, low taxes and deregulation of housing markets, less regulation, more innovation, things like that. So that fits the Silicon Valley mindset. And I think also the Silicon Valley has been very responsive to effective altruism and to rational thinking, right? So cost-benefit analysis, things like that. I think that's turned out to be very useful in Silicon Valley. The Amazon and Google hire a lot of economists now, right? So that kind of cost-benefit thinking, I think, and rationality in general, including effective altruism, has kind of been our bit of our sweet spot and has connected us with Silicon Valley.
And Marginal Revolution just gradually gained traction over the years. You had more and more followers, and as you said, Silicon Valley people found this sweet spot. And it's very interesting because it seems that, you and Tyler are both based in George Mason University, and George Mason University's economics department, it isn't a traditionally, ranked top 10 school like Harvard or MIT or so on, but it seems to have such a big influence over intellectual discourse. People in policy, in entrepreneurs, or even in the economics community, they really look up to you and whatever work is coming out of the department. So why is that? Could you tell us a little bit more about that part as well?
Yeah, so it's very funny that so many economics departments are just very similar, right? So economists ought to understand the value of product differentiation, and yet every second-ranked economics department tries to be Harvard. They tried to have, we're going to have one macro guy, we're going to have one micro guy and one econometrician person. And, we're just going to try and do whatever Harvard does. And George Mason has dared to be different. And part of that has been that we have a much broader public face in a way which nobody has had, since Chicago, since the decline of Chicago, right? So, you think about Chicago in the Milton Friedman years when Friedman was writing for Newsweek and, had he was blogging basically. Friedman was blogging, his column was, you could think of it as really blogging. And, he had a television show, right? Friedman had Free to Choose, right? And, so Nobel Prize winner speaking to the public on a regular basis with a television show, this is exactly what George Mason has tried to do and what Tyler and I have tried to do with our, Marginal Revolution University, the textbook, the blogging. We want to make economics valid and useful for thinking about the world and improving the world. And surprisingly, there isn't much scope for that. Like, people will come out with a paper, which is very relevant, has a lot of relevant, useful information, but departments are not organized along those grounds. And I'm very fortunate that George Mason, our department chair and the whole environment has regarded outreach as for part of teaching, right? This is something which counts, which is not regarded, snootily. At the very beginning, when we started Marginal Revolution, a lot of people look down their nose, oh, you're just writing for the public instead of, writing, in the AER or the JPE or something like that.
You have to publish in top journals.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the pursuit of academics.
But the funny thing is now these people, they send us their papers and they say, hey, maybe you would want to blog about my paper.
So did it ever occur? I mean, people must have made offers to you and Tyler Cowen say, oh, come join Harvard faculty, come join our wonderful department where you can collaborate with more famous economists who can get you on top journals and so on. And it seems to be a very cozy environment at the top schools. Did that ever appeal to you in any way?
Harvard has not been beating down my door. Maybe that'll still happen. But look, I will say this. I feel enormously fortunate. The office next door to mine is Robin Hanson. Across the hall is Brian Kaplan. Down the hall is Tyler Cowen. So it's amazing when I go to conferences and even though Tyler is like down the street, down the hall from me, I'd still go hear a Tyler Cowen talk because the guy is something new every single day. And even though I see Tyler, almost every day, even if I'm at a conference, he'll be more interesting than somebody else. So I'm very, very fortunate to have great colleagues at George Mason in a very supportive environment.
As an academic, do you feel like economics academia is moving towards a more open direction, like what George Mason is doing, or perhaps more closed? Because I mean, I'm in the Princeton's economics department as an undergraduate, and I was thinking about applying for PhD programs. And my professor was telling me, oh, Tiger, yeah, before you do that, you should do 2 years of what they call as pre-doctoral fellowship. You go work for a very famous professor in MIT or Harvard for 2 years. They write you a very great recommendation letter. And then you also make some connections. You get more familiarized with the research. So it's 2 years of pre-doc, 6 years of PhD, 2 years of postdoc, wherever. So you can really hit the ground running as an assistant professor when you're 35 or something. But it seems that people are, I mean, also these people are very, very good when they came out of those pre-doc programs after they worked, their statistics, their math. So do you think that the economics profession has on one hand become more specialized and better because the competition is fiercer, but on the other end, less open to other outsiders or quirky people who don't have that kind of pedigree to enter?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Now that the career profile which you just indicated, I think, is becoming a dominant profile for the people at the very top. And yeah, some of these people, some of whom I've been working with on this accelerating, health technologies team, some of our, graduate assistants and undergraduates, they are absolutely brilliant, brilliant people, right? It's kind of amazing to think. And I think this is a reflection of inequality in society as well as in the economics departments, right? It's become more of a winner take all market, right? And the returns to being at the very top have gotten really, really high, even higher, than the increase in the average return, especially when you think about a lot of what the top guys are doing. Like, Raj Shetty is the classic example, but Acemoglu is another example, is they're not writing papers by themselves anymore. They're running research teams, right?
It's a huge lab. It's
huge lab. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And they are, pumping out papers like a production process, right? And so the skills which you need are quite different. You've got to manage these entire teams. Now, having said that, is there still room? Like I say, I've managed to crawl my way to the middle, right? So there, I did not have that pedigree, did not have that path. I've done okay. And I think there is still, you can have a great career and not be necessarily, hitting that, AER, JPE, every couple of years. It's still it's a great profession, and being a professor is a great job. I mean, now you have to enjoy it. So if you're going to do that, the 2 years of the research, undergraduate thing, and then, your PhD, you better enjoy the process along the way, right? You better get some returns from it along the way, because otherwise it's just going to be too hard. It's just going to be, too much of a grind. But being a professor is a fantastic job. Like, I have no boss, right? It's incredible. I get to choose my own time, like when I'm in the office, when I'm not in the office. I mean, it's astounding how much freedom we have as professors. I mean, you may have to cut this part because we don't want the regular public to know, right? But like, what other job? Okay, this is the secret. What other job do they tell you? Oh, every 7 years or so, we'll pay you to take a break. We'll call it a sabbatical and go somewhere and, learn something else or take a break. And, and we're going to pay you to do that, right? To take a break from your job every 7 years just to refresh your batteries. It's astounding. It's astounding. So if you can get there, it's a very, very good job to have.
So Professor Tabarrok, I know we're on this topic of economics for a while, but one last question from me. So let's say there's some student like me at my age who listen to this interview, they read your blog, they read Tyler Cowen, they say these people are so cool. They don't care about the traditional boundaries and constraints of the tyranny of the big journals or so on. They want to just make impactful, good research. But it seems that for these kids to be able to get to your position, it seems very hard, because they can go to even a top PhD program. Maybe they end up at a state school as an assistant professor, because I mean, nowadays there's no guarantee that you can ever get into MIT, even though you could be a top student. So they start as a professor there. Do you still think they can still build up as the kind of influence over intellectual discourse for policy like you have? Because it does seem that academia or economics is also a winner-take-all kind of sphere, where the GMU, George Mason people like you and Tyler Cowen have a great influence over intellectual discourse. But I don't know any other second-tier school professors who do have this kind of influence and pedigree. So it seems that there's only you and Tyler Cowen, or you have all the top journal editors. Like, is that true, or how should we break free from that?
Well, look, you can still have a great career at a state school and do lots of fun things, and publish important research. It's a different model than you don't have to be Tyler Cowen or Alex Tabarrok in order to have fun in the profession. And one thing which the profession rewards specialization more than it rewards, this broad perspective that sort of Tyler and I might have. But even when you specialize, you will find that one day, I don't know when might not be this year, it might not be next year, it might not be for 10 years, but one day you will find yourself to be the world's expert on the question which the world wants answered right now. Okay, right? And so that could be, that's a big deal. That could be a huge amount of fun, and you have to wait for your time. But almost anything which economists are doing nowadays is empirically relevant, and people want to know. And look, there's a whole bunch of other careers as well. Like I said, with Amazon, with Google, in public policy, if you want to be a generalist, there's lots of think tanks working for the World Bank. It's a very broad kind of degree, especially if you have some, data analytics. That can be applied in a lot of different ways. I do, one of the other things I do is consulting for crypto companies. Okay.
Wow. We should get in there very soon. Yes, please.
Yeah. Right. And, the interesting thing is, again, economists have something relevant to say there, and our advice is in demand. So, to you or, to other students, I'm still pretty pumped up on the profession. The returns are very asymmetric. There's a lot of inequality. But even if you're not at the top, it's a great, being a professor is a great job, and being an economist is a kind of a great way of seeing the world, I think.
I was going to ask you about the great stagnation, but perhaps we should talk about crypto first. How are things going on that front? I mean, everybody's talking about like Bitcoin these days in media. It's crazy. So I don't know. What do you think about the crypto space, blockchain technology, Bitcoin?
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm an enthusiast, but not quite a super enthusiast, perhaps. I mean, look, I think Bitcoin has proven itself as a digital gold, right? As a asset, like gold. It's not proven itself kind of as a currency or as a medium of exchange. However, there are now quite a few stable coins, which really are looking very, very promising. There's been some busts, to be sure, but there are now stable coins which have held solid throughout the massive swings in the price of underlying assets, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and so forth. And these stable coins really look nice and solid. Much better record on the stable coins. We've only got a few years worth, but there's a better record on stable coins than there are on most currencies being immune to big crises. There's very, very few currencies which have been as stable as stable coins had they faced similar ups and downs in the underlying assets they're trying to tie to. So anyway, stable coins, I think, are it's obvious that people are going to use digital money, right? And you can do that a lot cheaper with crypto than you can using the current system. Like I just sent a wire to India. I was buying some art in India, and I think it was like I spent like $1,500 or something like that, and it was at least $100. So $50 from my bank and $50 from an intervening bank, which is not a lot of money, but that's like 10 or 8% of what I was spending. Right now, I also recently moved a bunch of crypto. Okay, I'm not like hugely wealthy, don't get the wrong idea, but I used but more than $1,000, and it cost me less than 50 cents, to move it from one, bank to another bank. So I was able to move large amounts of crypto for very, very little money. So if you think about that, the $100 versus 50 cents. So crypto is like 200 times cheaper, if I've got the numbers right, and so there's a huge amount of potential gain just from that factor alone. And then you add on the fact that in these crypto worlds, it's really a new way of collaborating. With cryptography and blockchain, we have a new way of bringing people together who don't know necessarily one another, who do not necessarily trust one another, but through a smart contract, they can cooperate with one another. So these decentralized autonomous organizations, the DAOs, I have said that the creation of the DAO may be as important as the creation of the limited liability company in 1600, with the creation of the East India Company. It may be as big a deal as that, because you can bring people together who may not even know, not only have they not worked together in the past, they may be anonymous to one another. So almost for the very first time, you have a group who trust one another without knowing who the other person is. And it's possible to do that with cryptography. So I think the larger space is one of a new way of collaborating and cooperating that these technologies make possible, which is going to have very, very large effects down the line.
This is fascinating, Professor Tabarrok, because I feel like most economists, or at least mainstream economists, are really not big fans of Bitcoin. They think it's a speculative asset. If they think it does not have all the properties of a currency, it probably does not even act as a good digital gold or inflation hedge, and it costs so much social resources when it comes to using more electricity in Netherlands because of the current proof of work model. So whereas the Silicon Valley people are so optimistic about this in Balaji, I mean, we previously talked about Balaji. He was one of the pioneers when it comes to advocating for this, and now he's like writing a newsletter that basically pays people in crypto to do things. So again, do you again find yourself standing in between those two group of people and trying to bridge whatever conversation they're trying to have?
Yeah, my son, by the way, recently won $100 in Bitcoin from Balaji for an essay that he wrote.
Yes, he's like, you could post a video of you doing 50 push-ups or something, and you may have a chance to win $100 in Bitcoin.
He didn't get it for push-ups. He got it for writing an essay. So sort of following in his father's footsteps.
Oh, that's wonderful.
On charter cities, actually. So kind of a pretty cool.
Great. Yeah.
Look. If even like 10% of what Balaji says is true, or even 5%, it's absolutely huge, right? It's absolutely huge. And Balaji, I think, look, he was ahead on the pandemic by like 2 months. I think he may be ahead on crypto by like 2 years or 5 years. But a lot of what he says, I think, will happen. And again, if even only 5% or 10% happens, then that is a massive, massive change. And he's talking about really how cryptography can undermine the nation state. Like, why are we organized geographically, right? That, in a way, is a peculiar thing. When we go online, we're not organized geographically at all, right? Like my friends online, the people I interact with all over the world, were organized by our interests, by, our, maybe we're economists in one way, or people interested in, cryptography, or interested, in history, or whatever it happens to be, there's a million interests, right? But you're not organized geographically. Rarely do I go out, let's, find people in my neighborhood. There's a few things like that, but geography is only one of the ways in which we can organize ourselves. And yet it's the primary way in which we organize ourselves politically. But that does not have to be the case. And in fact, in the past, people were not so organized geographically, even politically. They were organized by, according to the either through the church, right?
Religion,
the government,
ideology.
Yeah, and there were church courts, right? As well, ecclesiastical courts, as well as state courts. And they had jurisdiction over different kinds of disputes, and you had some choice. There were multiple competing courts, and you had some choice. There was like a merchant's court, right? And if you had a dispute with another merchant, you took it to the Lex Mercator. I can't say it. You took it to the merchant courts. Okay. And if you had a dispute involving morals or something like that, you went to the church courts. And if you had a dispute involving something else, you went to the state courts. And these courts had overlapping jurisdictions and, the competing jurisdictions. Anyway, so we may be coming to something more like that, where we organize ourselves cryptographically and by interest. And like think about even work. Like, what does the minimum wage mean? Okay, when I hire people in Indonesia on Fiverr, like, it doesn't make sense anymore, right? The minimum wage is totally a geographic thing. Like, how can it possibly make sense if, and which is something I do, by the way, like for my PowerPoints, I outsource them to a team in Indonesia who, jazzes them up and, puts in some animations and stuff like that.
Huge productivity gains, potentially.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, if you're hiring people from other countries, what on earth does a minimum wage mean? It doesn't mean anything, right? And so we may have to change our entire perspective and may become much more normal to think about our political connections as being online rather than as being offline geographic.
It does seem that this way of thinking of blockchain technology, I mean, we can, first of all, separate out the Bitcoin prices swings. I mean, setting aside all that, just looking at the technology and the political vision itself of what blockchain technology could do. Do you think it's a very optimistic way of, a techno-optimistic way of thinking? Even, for example, something like Charter City, we had Mark Lutter on the show, who was a George Mason graduate and the director of the Charter City Institute. And he was telling us charter cities are essentially those, free ports, free trade ports, but with their even own legal jurisdictions. And so you can even try different laws and voting systems in these cities. So it's fascinating, but we haven't really had too many actual applications of Charter City, maybe perhaps because of limitations of political governance systems, especially emerging markets. A lot of times the human nature just seems to hold back a lot of these innovations. And it also seems to be the case for blockchain technology, where a lot of political theorists have written how if you look into the dynamic between those who own the DAO, the DAO, and those who do not, and so on, it still seems that the same questions, the same political questions come back again and again. It's an old question. So that's the first part I would like to ask you, Professor Tabarrok, which is, it seems that the techno-optimistic part of me, I have a hard time to overcome that when I look at the history, when I look at politics, when I look at the tendencies of human again and again.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's optimistic, but it happens whether it's going to be optimistic or pessimistic. Right? Change is happening, especially in this ground, and this is a pure case. It's interesting how the themes we've been talking about come up again and again and again, and this is another case of exponentially growing process. Right? If something happens in blockchain, in cryptography, or something like that, then what will happen is nothing, and then suddenly everything will change, right? It is one of these exponential processes, the online processes, right? I mean, think about Facebook, Google, Twitter. These are some of the fastest adoption technologies which we have ever had, right? Facebook goes from, being Harvard dorm, just a few people in our lifetimes, right? Swapping, information in the Harvard dorm, to now there's 2 billion people, 2 billion, not million, billion, 2 billion people on Facebook. And that has happened incredibly quickly. And the ramifications are still being worked out. We have by no means adopted to all of these rapid changes. And the same thing is true with crypto. It's going to be nothing. It's going to be nothing. It's going to be nothing. And then suddenly you'll be working for a DAO, and you'll wonder, how did this happen? Like, I'm not going to work for a DAO. I'm going to work for George Mason. But Tiger, you may spend up a lot of your career working for a Dow. That's quite possible. My kids may spend some of their time working for a Dow, and it'll happen. We won't even, it'll happen so quickly. It'll just seem normal, but the ramifications are going to be huge.
This is the idea of exponential growth of which is the same thing as COVID, which is like three cases to 3,000 cases in 3 days.
Exactly. And no one is prepared for it. I don't think that the regulators will be too slow to stop it. And this technology, it's very peculiar, right? There are places in the world which do not have good street lighting, where everybody has a cell phone, a smartphone, right? So there are places in the world where a technology which was developed, by Thomas Edison in, 1898 or whatever it was, about that time, they're still not using that technology. They don't have a sewage system, which, London had, in 1850, right? So some of these technologies, particularly those requiring coordinated action, requiring government, they take a very, very long time to be distributed around the world. And yet the cell phone, smartphone technology is everywhere. I mean, I remember a few years ago, I was in a car in a highway in Rajasthan, India, and I was able to tweet from the moving car, right? That was unbelievable. And the first time I was able to send an email from a plane 30,000 feet in the sky. So these technologies now are everywhere. And if you have a smartphone, which again, let's remember that a smartphone is more powerful than a Cray supercomputer of a few years ago. You have a smartphone, you now have access to the entire world's knowledge, and you have access to blockchain, and you have access to cryptography, and you have access to a lot of job opportunities and work and a whole superstructure space, right? That is huge. And this technology has just grown faster than anything we've ever seen before.
You mentioned India. My friends in India were telling me how India essentially skipped credit cards. They just leaped into fintech, financial technology. I mean, everybody pays their phone, whatever. So there is this idea of technology innovations could jump a lot of hurdles that they do not progress in the stage that we think America has experienced or so on. Absolutely. So I guess one last pushback I may have on this idea is that a lot of people, the current criticism is that if you actually look into the space of innovation or the actual applications of blockchain technology, it's mostly for payments, Uniswap, or a lot of those decentralized exchanges. So it seems that's why a lot of people were saying, what are you saying how blockchain structure could give us new political sovereignties, whatever, when everything is just basically exchanges. And you would essentially be responding by saying the progress could happen exponentially. There are people working on these projects, and it almost seems to be an inevitable trend that we head towards digital currency, blockchain, when these things have emerged.
And people have no clue, right? This is the first 2 or 3 deaths, right? As we were talking about earlier, and the tidal wave is coming. So I think, you're right. Like all of this DeFi, right? Decentralized finance, where now hundreds of billions of dollars are being exchanged. Now, it is true, right, that this is mostly one crypto for another, right? So very little impact yet on the real world. But really, this is a sandbox. You are exchanging hundreds of billions of dollars on decentralized finance, and the systems are being developed to do that securely. So the systems on decentralized finance, although we hear, about the failures, because, the guy, absconds with his computer, and it turns out he has all of the keys and all that kind of stuff. Really what's going on is that the decentralized finance is developing much more cryptographically secure technologies than the New York Stock Exchange, right? The New York Stock Exchange, the technologies there are nowhere near as secure. That's okay, because they're so much slower and there's so much more room for human, involvement, and let's fix this and something like that. But the New York Stock Exchange, every single stock exchange in the world is now vulnerable to crypto. Okay? All you need to do is to tokenize, a stock, and the advantages of doing it on crypto are absolutely immense. Like, it was very peculiar to my kids. They wanted to, when they, GameStop, they wanted to, have some fun, taking a short on GameStop. And very peculiar for them to realize that the markets are closed. What? They're only open, a few hours, 8 hours a day. They're not open.
Centralized exchange.
Yeah, they're not open Saturdays and Sundays. Meanwhile, I can exchange my crypto 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. What's going on here, right? This looks so primitive. It's like, I remember, again, my kids grew up with TiVo, which is now sort of dated, right? But the point was that they grew up where they went to a television and they chose what they wanted to watch. And then they went to grandma's house and they were very confused because what do you mean I have to wait a certain time to watch a television show? Why isn't it ready for me? Why isn't it there right now? And the same thing is true with finance. Like, why can't you trade 24 hours a day? I can watch a movie 24 hours a day. I can go to Netflix and choose what I want to watch, when I want to watch it, pause it, whatever. Why don't I have, why don't the financial markets work like that? In crypto, they do. So not only is it going to be cheaper, it's going to be faster, it's also going to be more secure. I mean, people are going to lose a lot of money before it gets all the way, right? But if you're careful, crypto is right now, it's more secure than the standard financial system. And so that means that everything is being developed, okay? And it's being readied. And then suddenly we're going to see stocks put onto crypto, tokenized, and it's going to explode.
So none of this is financial advice, investment advice, obviously, but what would be some of the projects that you find exciting, either tokens or coins themselves, some of the projects there were companies, startups?
So I'm an advisor to Elrond, which is a Ethereum competitor. So again, yeah, I don't advise buying it or anything like that. But they're a very hardworking team, and I'm really impressed with them as a team. So I think that's why I like that. Another interesting project I've been involved with is a library, LBRY. Library is a YouTube competitor. And the projects I've been involved with, I've been very pleased in that they're not just white papers, they're actual existing projects. They work. So right now, you can go to library, LBRY, and download videos, watch videos. It is a working, living competitor to YouTube, and it cannot be censored, okay? Because it's on the blockchain, if you upload videos to it, you cannot be censored. It's censorship resistant. And that, a lot of people now are beginning to think that how valuable this is, because as a creator, right? If you're creating YouTube content and you can put up years of YouTube videos, right? And then suddenly YouTube says, oh, you're politically incorrect, you're gone. And your entire work of many years,
your connection with your fans, everything
is cut, is just cut. So that's very dangerous for a creator not to have the keys to their kingdom, to their own kingdom, right? YouTube owns the keys to your kingdom. And unfortunately, this creates a bad dynamic in that excuse me, in that some of the early adopters of crypto, including something like, library, censorship resistant, and so forth, they're the flakes. They are the weird people there who, are most afraid of being deplatformed, right? So that therefore some of these platforms can get a bad reputation. But that, I think, is missing the underlying picture. which is that you want the keys to your own kingdom, and therefore you should be, uploading your project to a library, at least as a backup. You should at least have it there as a backup. But also these technologies, they can be faster, they can work better. Decentralized technologies, not always, but often they can actually work better than their centralized components. So I think that is also going to be another selling point.
So we were interviewing Matt Weinberg, who is a Princeton computer science professor who does a lot of mechanism design work around cryptocurrency. And he was telling us that the Turing Prize winner, Silvio Macali, who, from MIT, Turing Prize, huge. I mean, this is a huge deal that he won the Turing Prize. It's the most prestigious prize in math and science these days. Basically, is starting Algorand.
Algorand, correct.
So correct. So Professor Tabarrok, will you be the next? I mean, basically the giant in economics that is departing from academia.
Well, I mean, Hal Varian, right? Wrote a famous textbook and then became Google's chief economist and got very, very rich. So, so I'm hoping to be Elrond's chief economist, or, there's some other projects which I can't actually tell you about, which are very exciting, but
wow,
I can't tell you about them yet. But, keep tuned. There's some very exciting projects coming down the line, which I'm a part of. And no, you're absolutely right. Like, I've also worked with Tim Rothgarden, who's another winner of
he's a Columbia, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not sure if it's the Turing, maybe it's I think he was the Turing Prize winner for algorithmic game theory. If it wasn't I might have gotten confused. It might have been.
It might be some other prestigious.
Yeah, it's a very prestigious prize in computer science. David Shor, the quantum computation guy, also got one of these prizes. Anyway, so I think I take your point very seriously in that top computer scientists, as you've mentioned, they are all interested in these technologies. They don't think it's a waste of time. So that does tell you something.
Professor Tabarrok, we are nearing the end of our interview. I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I suppose in conversation with Tyler, which is a very famous podcast that Professor Cowen hosts, he always has these quick fire questions that don't seem to be entirely related per se. So maybe we can do some of those quick questions at the end. Maybe the first one I would say is you emailed me about this idea, dominant assurance contract. So maybe we can start there. Well, what are those?
So this is an idea, a mechanism which I created a number of years ago, recently tested successfully in the lab. It's like Kickstarter. On Kickstarter, you give money until a threshold is reached, and your money isn't taken from you until you reach the threshold. Or to put it slightly differently, you get all your money back if not enough is collected to reach the threshold to produce the public good. We add to that refund bonuses, which is that if you don't reach the threshold, then you get a bonus, you get paid. And the amazing thing about this is a very, very simple idea, and yet it solves in many ways the public good problem. It solves a big chunk of the public good problem. Because now, if I think that you're not going to contribute, then I want to contribute in order to get the refund bonus. And same thing for you. And so that this means that we always want to contribute, and the only equilibria in the refund bonus game is ones in which the public good is actually produced. So it's quite a simple mechanism, but has some quite remarkable properties.
What about the idea of bounty hunters that you emailed me about?
Bounty hunters, I love the bounty hunters. So I wrote a paper on them, a statistical paper comparing them to the police. They're more effective than the police in getting their man. And I actually got to know some of these bounty hunters, and I actually went bounty hunting once in Baltimore. So that was my attempt to be like Steve Levitt. Wow. Steve Levitt takes his students out with the police, and I went bounty hunting, but that's a story for another day.
So unemployment rate in the coming months, up or down?
Down.
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 Inflation in the coming months, up or down?
Up. Stimulus was too big, but it's okay, but it's going up.
Do you worry about the persistent inflation problem, or do you think the Federal Reserve has it contained?
I've learned that the world is more challenging and surprising than I could expect. So I don't know. I don't know. Anything could happen. I think I'm not like worried about it. Okay. But my priors are pretty diffuse on a lot of different questions now.
Did you get an invite to be at the Miami Bitcoin conference this past June? And if not, would you be open to attending one day?
Yeah, I did get an invite. I didn't go. Maybe I should have. I guess I should have, but yeah, it conflicted with some other things.
What do you think of the Bitcoin community or the Bitcoin maximalists? A lot of people say it's almost like a cult.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm not a Bitcoin maximalist, so I guess I'm not quite a member of the cult. But I like this. Overall, I think. Look, it's like electricity. It's like these. It's a general purpose technology. These blockchains and cryptography is a general purpose technology. I'm very enthusiastic about the field as a whole, but I have no idea whatsoever, which of the many attempts are going to succeed. So I've placed a few bets just in terms of consulting, but it's very difficult to predict which firm within this large space is going to succeed.
What are your thoughts on charter cities?
I'd like to live one. I think we do too little experimentation. So yeah, I like to see a lot more experimentation with governance. So charter cities, governance in the in hyperspace and in the computer space, I think is very interesting. Like there's a lot more room for experimentation. We're spending so much of our time online, moving from world to world online. Online has satisfied most of the conditions of the Tibu model for the economists in the crowd. So thinking about applying the Tibu model to the online worlds, I think is very useful.
If the United States government had given all the vaccines to Amazon, do you think the vaccines would have been distributed much quickly with Prime 2-day shipping or whatever, that we would get vaccinated faster?
I'm not sure. It's a little bit more complicated than that. I have argued in favor of investing more in nasal vaccines and in oral pill vaccines. Because people are afraid of needles, and the needles mean you need the kind of a medical system distribution. While if we had a pill or you had you squeeze it up your nose, that would help with distribution a lot. So I do think there's still room there to improve the technology to help us with distribution.
If you had full dictatorial power over the country and had to appoint a council of people of whom you would pass that power to, whether it's 1, 2, 5, 10, 20 people, who would those people be?
I'm not sure I want dictatorial power, but I'll say this. In the pandemic, Trump put together, a pandemic response team, with like Ivanka was on the team. It's totally ridiculous. He never did anything, right? Absurd. But if I had put together my pandemic response team, Emily Oster, Zeynep Tufekci, I'm probably saying her name wrong, Paul Romer, Michael Mina, maybe myself. There was a opportunity there, Richard Hatchett. There were people who understood the crisis. They, generally speaking, were not at the top of the power hierarchy. But there were people out there who understood the crisis and who were addressing it with data and technology, and who were really thinking about this hard. So we could have done much better than we did. And had we had a team such as I just suggested, I humbly, modestly, whatever, arrogantly, I think we could have done better.
If you can press the button right now and end social media, including, I don't know, TikTok or Facebook or whatever, would you do that?
No, I just don't know. I mean, I wouldn't, I would have no clue whether that would be on net beneficial or negative. So I let people make their own choices. I do think this, look, so here's a negative. This is my own kind of pet theory. the rise of Hitler and things like that, right? I think that was not coincidentally also the rise of new technologies like the movie theater, like movies, film. Like now to us, when you look at Hitler, he seems like kind of a joke, right? I mean, he's got this funny mustache, this almost Charlie Chaplin-like, and he's like screaming and yelling. He just kind of, I don't get it. Like, it's hard to understand, like, how did this guy enthuse millions of people? But when you combine that with, you were seeing him literally as a giant, okay, on a movie screen. So for the very first time, you're seeing these people, they're like gods, right? This technology, your brain is not used to it, okay? Your brain is not used to it. And so you see them in these contexts and all these new, Lily Riefenstahl and all these new techniques. And your brain is just not able to comprehend it because it's too early. I think social media is exactly the same thing. So I do think there's lots of dangers to social media, particularly the one good thing about the communist government in China is that they have been authoritarian, but they haven't been populist. So I worry about a populist authoritarian in China who takes advantage of social media, the next generation, the younger generation of leadership who take advantage of social media and take advantage of sort of a naive population, naive in the sense of not having experience with social media. Like my kids are much more experienced with social media than, even I am, right? So, they were born in it and all that. And I think their brains are better attuned to be more skeptical, right? And to kind of be able to navigate these worlds. So I think it does take time. And unfortunately, the technology is happening more quickly than our brains are adapting. But I hope we will get through this period and make it through on the other end okay.
What would be your underrated and overrated? Professor Cowen always asks that question to his guests.
Like in general of anything?
Yeah.
I'll say Tyler Cowen is still underrated, which is amazing because he's rated very highly. But when you watch these conversations with Tyler, and he asks these questions of the economists, and very, detailed questions and, insightful questions. And that's one thing. Okay, he's an economist, you understand that. And then he asks the poets, and he asks them all of these incredible questions. I don't even understand all the questions, right? And then he asks, the epidemiologists and the psychologists and all of these guys, the historians. And Tyler has an answer to every single question that he asks. And, so he is still underrated. He is still underrated. The depths of his knowledge, which is still growing all of the time. Like he did a video, a podcast, and a lot of the podcast was discussion of Jamaican reggae. And like it turns out he's like an expert on reggae music. And I've known him for 30 years. And I didn't know that he knew as much about reggae music as he actually does, right? So I'm continually, I have not been able to plumb those depths, and he's learning more every day. So I'm very, very fortunate to have Tyler as a colleague and as a friend. He's a very remarkable person.
Anything that you think is overrated? I mean, that's honestly too broad of a question, I guess, to be answered even.
Overrated. I mean, most things are overrated.
Okay, that sounds great. I guess the last question, the name of our show is Policy Punchline. So I want to ask you at the end, what would the punchline be here? Either about COVID or crypto or techno-optimism or whatever, however you may call this.
Let's see. I guess the punchline is it's great to be an economist. So I'm happy about the field in general. And it gives you a really great tools for seeing the world. We say the punchline, the tagline for my textbook with Tyler, Modern Principles of Economics is see the invisible hand, understand your world. And I think that's a great thing for students to have. And you're learning a great set of techniques, data and analytical techniques, which can apply to a lot of areas. So I'm very encouraging of all the students. I think you have great careers ahead of you. It's an exciting time. And I look forward to reading your papers, Tiger.
Thank you so much, Professor Tabarrok. It's such a great honor to meet you and finally have you on the show. I mean, I think mostly all my friends in Silicon Valley would be enthused to watch all this. But thank you so much again for joining me today.
Great. Thank you, Tiger.
Well, this concludes this episode of Policy Punchline. That was with Alex Tabarrok. He's a professor of economics at George Mason University. Also just a wonderful public intellectual who has played a very pivotal role at the beginning of the pandemic, helping with the policy responses. And also going forward, we really encourage you to follow his Twitter at @Tabarrok on Twitter, but also his various other works and writings on Marginal Revolution, which is the famous economics blog that he and Tyler Cowen has started. It would also be great for you to listen to Tyler Cowen's podcast, Conversations with Tyler. As Professor Tabarrok has mentioned, it's has a wide variety of conversations from economics to poetry to literature to other fields as well. So thank you so much for listening today. Please follow us on the YouTube, iTunes, Spotify. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Policy Punchline, a podcast generously supported by the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at Princeton University. We would also like to encourage you to follow other podcasts produced by Princeton University, such as Politics and Polls by the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Policy Punchline is intended to be informational only and does not reflect nor represent the views of Princeton University or the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. For more information on subscription, donation, volunteering, or contact, please visit policypunchline.com. Thank you again for listening.